Hello, everybody. I'm here with well-known Russian agent Michael Tracey. Michael.
I just wish my status as a Russian agent entailed some kind of financial remuneration because that has never come. I keep looking for the check,
Yeah,
but it doesn't arrive.
you'll get an island or something soon. You'll be brought into the oligarch class.
I'm waiting.
What's going on, man? How you doing? Long time no talk.
Yeah. I guess we spoke in what?
December, I think.
December
That's
of
right.
last.
So now
yeah,
you're part of the TYT network. Welcome.
Yeah, it's been a couple months now since that happened, and it's been interesting. It's been pretty, it's great because one of the mandates that I got, and I think mostly anyone gets when they join the network or they join TYT, is that they want you to maintain independence and autonomy, and yet you still get the institutional backing of a highly successful media operation.
Yeah.
So to me, that's sort of like the best of both worlds.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, what we're about to talk about here is the perfect example of like a very clear divide within TYT. I'm part of the network, and I have a pretty strong stance on this Russia issue. I think you do as well. Jordan Chariton, I think, is more in agreement with us on this issue. But then you have people like Jank and maybe John Idarola and some others who really strongly disagree with us on this. But you're right. It's nice that you can kind of have these vibrant back and forths and not feel in any way like you're risking your job or anything like that,
Yeah, and I think that's really crucial to maintain an atmosphere and a climate where people can actually do their own sort of reasoning and their own inquiry.
Totally.
If you felt stifled because what you say might contradict what other people say, and then that's just, what's the point?
Yeah, so before we get into the Russia thing, I just have to bring it up real fast because I saw it on Twitter the other day and I was fascinated by it. You somehow were with Kurt Eichenwald at like his house or something. Okay, for people who don't know, Kurt Eichenwald is like a Newsweek writer. He's kind of like, I would describe him as like kind of the chief Democratic partisan hack pro-Hillary rah-rah crowd. And just like a silly person who uses silly anti-Trump attacks. And so what happened? What was that about? And he didn't know you from Twitter or anything, and he kind of let you in? Because I have a feeling if he knew you, he wouldn't have even let you in.
Well, no, but the public was free to come in because it was a public home liquidation sale or an estate sale.
Okay.
So it was open to the general public, so anybody could walk in. It wasn't him determining who could or could not come in.
So was it like a family member of his passed away and they were selling old stuff or something?
It's hard to really know. He on Twitter, and I actually didn't see this, but somebody just sent me a note about it, and I happened to be in the Dallas area at the time where he lives. So I was like, okay, I gotta go to this. There's no question in my mind that I'm going to this home liquidation sale.
Oh, geez.
If only for the lulz, and there were lulz aplenty. But he had been basically promoting this home liquidation sale, saying that he hired this firm to come and gather all the belongings that had accumulated in his Dallas home over the course of however many years. And his ostensible reason for doing it is because he wanted to downsize, because he was moving into a new house. His children are no longer living there, which I guess is plausible, but there's always like a tinge of weirdness when it comes to Kurt Eichenwald. You're never quite sure what the hell is going on.
Yeah.
So I just went as a member of the general public and took some photos and just checked it out. I'm going to write something on it. I don't know. It's sort of like coming into...
When he learned who you are after the fact on Twitter, was he like, what have I done? Like, why was I even talking to this guy? Because if he does a search of his name and your Twitter, like there will probably be like a good dozen tweets of you just ripping his stupidity to shreds.
Yeah, he actually had some good humor about it. And it's funny, when he was there actually signing books. It was bizarre. It was like he was holding this impromptu book signing at his home while people were like coming in and out and like taking his old dishware and clothing and like old CDs and DVDs and just a really weird variety of stuff. Like even he was putting up for sale his toiletries.
What?
So, like, you could literally go and purchase Kurt Eichenwald's nose hair trimmer.
Oh my god, that's so bizarre.
So that to me, that alone to me raised questions about what exactly was going on.
Yeah.
But he was also there like for a set period signing books. So of course he had a bunch of extra books on hand because he's written a number of books. Some people were buying them and he was signing them. It was like he was at a bookstore doing a signing, but just sitting there in his dining room.
Yeah.
So it was just weird. I don't think he didn't know it. I don't think he knew who I was. But when I was talking to him, by pure coincidence, somebody who, like, for some reason knew me, was standing there at the time, said, "Are you Michael Tracey?" And I'm like, "Yeah. Hey, how are you?"
Oh man.
And so like my identity was revealed when I was standing there talking to him, which was fine. And he later actually gave me a blessing to write about it and tweet about it.
Wow. Well, that's bizarre. I mean, remember
his online persona can be really deranged at times and just flat out like inexplicable. But when I was talking to him, he like came across as relatively normal.
Yeah.
So
I mean, on a personal level, I'm sure a lot of people who I would despise, like, who the fuck knows? Even if I had a conversation with Sean Hannity, I might be like, oh, he was kind of nice to me, but he's like just an odious person in general. But Eichenwald was most recently in the news because some Twitter troll sent to him like a strobe GIF or GIF, however the fuck you say it, and like it caused a seizure, or allegedly caused a seizure, and so he's like suing them now. And I was like, ooh.
Well, not only suing them, he petitioned for a criminal indictment, which was then handed down. So the troll, who allegedly sent this strobe GIF to Eichenwald, has been criminally charged.
That's a bad precedent, if you ask me. That's a slippery.
I know, and
that
was my reaction as well. Like, you're not broadening the confines of what constitutes a criminal act on the internet to include trolling. I mean, this mode of trolling I wouldn't endorse.
Oh, no way! Yeah, don't do that. But like,
but there's criminal. Difference between sanctioning something ethically and sanctioning it criminally, which gets you into a whole different territory. So when I was at Eichenwald's house, I kind of wanted to go and like into his bedroom and see if there were like chalk marks on the floor for like where the incident happened, like a criminal scene or something. But unfortunately, his bedroom wasn't open to the public.
Yeah, I was gonna say I wouldn't want to be anywhere near his bedroom anyway, so I would. It's probably a good thing. But
I got near his like socks and his hats and his nail clippers and all kinds of stuff that he thought people would be really motivated to purchase. And I guess maybe he was vindicated in that because a lot of people were purchasing a lot of junk.
Does he have a grandiose view of himself where it's like he thinks it's like selling Michael Jordan's jersey or some shit?
That was my theory. It's like, okay, the only reason you would think that people want to purchase your nose hair trimmer is if it's like people will go and try to find Elvis's nose hair trimmer and purchase it, and like keep it so it increases in value over the years or whatnot, or just because they're a crazy fan of Elvis or something. I guess Kurt puts himself in that category.
So now that we've gone on for 8 minutes and 30 seconds about Kurt Eichenwald, let's jump into the main reason here why.
Well, my head is spinning because of the downfall of Bill O'Reilly, which just broke as we entered this. So I mean, we must talk about Russia, but there's so much else going on; it's hard to focus.
I sent a little pithy tweet about that where I said, breaking, Bill O'Reilly is fired for pushing false information that helped get us into an illegal war. LOL, just kidding. That was like 14 years ago. Yeah, that's the thing.
My thought was, it's amazing how many people, I think we're roughly the same age, but I know for me, Bill O'Reilly was like a very towering figure when I was sort of forming my political outlook.
Mm-hmm.
He was somebody who seemed to be the manifestation of just the pro-Iraq right.
Yep.
So therefore, he was sort of like a pretty integral factor in just as a teen, like a young teen, I was sort of like developing my initial political beliefs. So, and I was a pretty avid consumer of right-wing media, not because I ever really agreed with it, but I just found it interesting, and I would always listen to him on the radio, and he had a radio show for a while, and then he was on TV. So Yeah, now that he could just kind of be discarded by Fox News because of some sexual harassment allegations, it just sort of, I don't know, it's just sort of stark and jarring.
Yeah, it's I always thought he was kind of like the master of presentation. I always held him up as kind of like the best at presenting something. Like, you know how some people talk, and when you listen to them talk, they have a tendency, like you have a tendency to just kind of immediately lose focus, and you got to force yourself to focus and listen to the person talking. That's like, Bill O'Reilly's like the opposite of that. When he opens his mouth, I just listen. I'm like, oh, what's he saying? Like, you want want to hear what he's saying because of how he presents himself. So he's always the master of presentation in my mind. But yeah, I do find it quite toxic that we're looking at a media landscape where if you're Brian Williams and you appear sexually aroused by launching an offensive strike against a country that didn't attack us, like that's not something that's grounds for firing. It's not something that's grounds for firing to cheerlead intervention nonstop. It's not something that's grounds for firing when, like, Reuters wrote an article the other day where they said Gary Cohn, a Goldman Sachs banker, Wall Street guy, is pushing Trump towards, quote, moderate policies. And then in the article, they go on to say moderate means deregulation and allowing the corporations to keep their money in tax havens. It's like, okay, all that stuff to me seems like, okay, they're just saying things that are not true or barbaric, and they're not doing their job as journalists or what's supposed to be a journalist. That's egregious. Now, Bill O'Reilly, I'm sure, well, actually, I'm not sure, but I'm not surprised if he indeed did do the things that are alleged against him when it comes to sexual harassment and whatnot. But I find it bizarre that it's like you always need like a sexual angle to bring down people who otherwise have been anathema to what journalism is supposed to be. Or with politicians, too, the same thing goes, same dynamics are at play.
Well, it's a legal liability. I mean, you don't incur any legal liability when you cheer on military intervention or even when you propagate falsehoods to justify intervention. But when you have multiple complainants arguing that you sexually harassed them, you open up both yourself and potentially your employer to legal sanction, which can go on for years and be a real public relations.
And the advertisers fled. That, to me, is always the most important. That's why they dumped Glenn Beck, because Glenn Beck, the same thing. His ratings went up in the midst of all of his craziness and him being a lunatic, but the advertisers were out, so they're like, we don't care how good your ratings are. We're not going to back you when you're not making any money.
Yeah. It seems like the most salient way to depose someone now is to accuse them of sexual assault, and I'm sure, or harassment. I'm sure a lot of these complaints have validity.
Yeah.
But it's just an interesting cultural shift.
Sure.
Where that now is the most potent way to remove somebody from a position of influence. Remember, Roger Ailes ran Fox News, and he had basically suffered the same fate. And these are extremely powerful people. I mean, Bill O'Reilly. First of all, I'm curious to just know what his net worth is at this point. It's got to be just absolutely staggering. He has,
I'd guess maybe 100 or more, 100 million or more, I would guess.
It's got to be more. I think it's probably more than that at this point.
Could be. I mean, if he's making 18 million a year and he's been working since 1996, I mean, who knows what he was making in 96 when he was on Fox News. But it was 96 to 2017, basically.
He's probably got, an ownership share in 21st century Fox, and then he has these line of books, all of which are always on the bestseller list. So
and he was always number one in the ratings too, which is incredible. Yeah. But I always mock like Rush Limbaugh. He's a paper tiger. Glenn Beck, paper tiger. They cite ratings from the fucking 90s for Rush Limbaugh's radio show to pretend like he's popular. Bill O'Reilly was actually popular. Now, granted, they're all like really, really old white men who watch him, but he's still number one in what's supposed to be cable news.
I know. One thing I was thinking is, I can remember back when the main enemy that O'Reilly elevated was this secular progressive phenomenon. Remember that?
He would say it with such scorn, secular progressives.
I know. And that was sort of motivating to me and helped kind of shape my worldview in a way, because I was just wanted to defend the validity of actually being a secular progressive when he was demonizing it. And I'm sure that's probably something that you had had focused on in the past as well, right?
Oh yeah, he's a bizarre character, and some of the fights, like his George Tiller thing was really, really fucked up. What ended up happening, like that guy was murdered. after O'Reilly kind of went on almost like a personal vendetta against the guy, where he would say misleading things about. I don't get me wrong.
I don't like what he did there, but I'm sort of hesitant to attribute. So if like you criticize a public figure even very viciously, and then some unhinged maniac goes and attacks physically the figure, are you thereby responsible or culpable? I think that's just a very slippery slope. So I don't really like the attribution of blame to O'Reilly for that.
Well, let me be clear.
Because it can be easily applied to. But I mean, the rhetoric itself.
Certainly not legally. Nobody's saying legally. In fact, the only way you could be held legally liable in a situation like that is if the direct is so incredibly, if the threat is so incredibly direct and specific. Like if he was on air and he said, I want somebody to go kill George Tiller and at 5:30 at this place at this, like then that's an issue. He didn't do that, obviously, but just the fact that he said these massively misleading things and portrayed the guy as somebody who kills babies, and then somebody went out and killed him. I mean, I hear you. What you're saying is like, okay, so somebody could take like a clip of me railing against Rachel Maddow for her Russia hysteria.
Yeah, exactly.
And then if something happens to Rachel Maddow, am I responsible for it? Of course not. It's to me, it seems like it's one of those things where if you are a public figure, like we are, for example, I try to be crystal clear. Like the other day, I told people you have to call Dianne Feinstein's office to let her know because she came out against single payer. Basically, come out in favor of single payer or we're going to vote against you. But I try to be clear, like, okay, but be kind be nice about it, but be clear about what you stand for. With a guy like Bill O'Reilly, it's just recklessness.
But if somebody was unkind and didn't abide by your directive, you still wouldn't be responsible for that.
No,
so
of course,
I just don't like giving any credence to the underlying logic which says that somebody is directly responsible if something that they said in a public forum was misconstrued or misinterpreted by some kind of unhinged person.
But the main point is the caveat versus not having the caveat. That's everything. So the caveat of, hey, I'm just saying here, don't do violence, don't do this, don't do that. Whereas Bill O'Reilly, again, I'm not saying he's legally responsible, and I'm not saying he's directly responsible. I'm just saying when you call somebody a baby killer, baby killer, baby killer, baby killer, and then somebody kind of acts on that, he, as a conscious human being, he needs to lay his head down on his pillow at night and go, maybe I should have been a little, clearer in my rhetoric there.
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. I just wonder, does that extend to the entirety of the half of the country who are opposed to abortion for religious reasons or for whatever other reason? If they say that, this abortion doctor is a killer of babies, and that's what they genuinely believe, they believe that an embryo constitutes a human life, and then they say that in public, are they also culpable if somebody goes and attacks? It's like the entire Catholic Church therefore responsible in the same way that O'Reilly is. I just don't know where the line is drawn.
Well, and abortion's also one of those issues where I feel like it's the number one issue where the left and the right just talk over each other's heads because you're just not having at no point is there like a connection in the arguments being made. One side is saying, look, it's choice, it's all the woman's choice and it's reproductive rights, and all modern nations have, healthcare and contraception and stuff like this. And the other side is like, no, you're doing murder. Like that is murder. And there's really no addressing of, they're just kind of talking past each other in that sense, which is why, I've always kind of, probably to the people in my audience probably aren't happy about this, but I've always described myself as more of a moderate on that issue. Like, I don't think it's a crazy thing to say, yeah, there's a line. Like, is there a line of viability or when the nervous system is developed in the fetus, then you're talking about fundamentally a different thing than if it's an embryo or if it's a zygote or a gamete. Like, those are different things at different stages of development, and one of them I see a moral discussion. The other one I think is people are being a little goofy when they try to say, like, a zygote, or an embryo in its earliest stage is equivalent to a human being.
Yeah, somebody who I think has really been effective in blurring or basically changing kind of the trite way that this issue is framed is Elizabeth Brunig. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's sort of
vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, she's a left-wing commentator and writer. She's an assistant editor at the Washington Post now, but she's a pro-life socialist. So she has always tried, I think, to approach the issue in a way that doesn't kind of land her in these left-right kind of screaming matches that have characterized the abortion debate. And I think there is sort of like a trend toward a sort of scrambling of where people are coming from on this issue, because also you see some, avowed atheists and secularists kind of saying that they are pro-life for non-religious reasons. So I think there are just different angles now that people are approaching it from that maybe are more conducive to a little more of a substantive inquiry.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky issues where it's hard to really make sense of it all. But yeah, you can make arguments from, but you know what? I think that at the end of the day, this is a great article I read a while ago. I wish I could remember who wrote it and in what outlet it was, but basically it was somebody who was just very pro-life, against abortion, and religious, and they wrote an article where they say, yeah, as a result of that, I vote Democratic. And they say the reason they vote Democratic is there are so many studies that suggest that when you have Planned Parenthood and free clinics and condoms available and the pill available and you put an onus on sex education, when you do those things, yes, you have to spend government money for it, but at the same time, that always correlates with a drop in abortion rate, unwanted pregnancy rate, lower STDs. So if your end goal is, hey, look, I want to limit the number of abortions and limit the number of unwanted pregnancies, well, the solution to that is following the path of the progressive policies which yield that outcome, even though that's not, you know what I'm saying? Even though it's not necessarily, they're not doing it directly. Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too and say, look, I want to ban abortion, but then also say in the next breath, we got to get rid of Planned Parenthood and we got to get rid of condoms and free clinics and the pill. It's like, okay, well then guess what? You're going to have more abortions. Yeah,
so I think, Bruning's argument, if I could just try to summarize it to the best that I could, it would probably be something along the lines of, since she is a left-wing Catholic, her stance in ameliorating abortion or mitigating the circumstances which would lead to abortion basically amounts to bolstering the welfare state, redistributing wealth to minimize the number of women who are driven to abortion for maybe economic reasons. And that would be a more fruitful approach by her lights than, say, just criminalizing abortion. Much as she might find it morally contemptible, the better policy approach would be to reform the economic system so as to minimize the number of women who are driven to abortion in the first place. So I think that's the difference in approach. Although on the core ethical issue, I mean, yes, she would have to say that abortion is an unjust termination of human life.
Right.
So that when you drill down into the nut of it, it sort of is intractable.
Right. Okay, so now let's finally get to Russia. So I got a lot to say about that. I'm sure you do too. I just read your article in CNBC right before we came on air here. You and I are probably 95% in agreement, but why don't you go ahead and explain to everybody why you think the rhetoric is not just incorrect from the corporate Democrats when it comes to this issue, but also dangerous.
Yeah. I don't know that it's even corporate Democrats who at this point I would blame for propagating the rhetoric and the wider paranoia, because unfortunately at this point, this narrative has been at full blast in the media for something like 9 months. And it was the prism through which many Democrats viewed the 2016 campaign. I mean, the Clinton campaign calculated that the best way to attack Trump would be by tying him to Russia. And eventually, if you keep beating that drum so often and so loudly, the precepts which underlie the narrative are going to get instilled in the population, or at least a segment of the population. So now you have people who I wouldn't even necessarily characterize as corporate Democrats, just sort of like grassroots activist types who want to oppose Trump or are part of the, quote, resistance. I think now they genuinely believe that the key to derailing Trump and to ultimately maybe even removing him is to pursue the Russia angle. And, the thing is, they may actually there might actually be a kernel of truth or validity in that, because I think it is true to some extent that the incessant focus on Russia in the Congress and in the media has to some extent hobbled Trump, or at least stymied him in his ability to pursue a governing agenda. So that's the thing. It might actually be politically expedient to keep banging this drum, because Trump's approval rating keeps sinking, and you could imagine that for people who don't follow politics especially closely, just this constant trickling of what appears to be something scandalous happening vis-a-vis Trump and Russia can actually shape their opinions, and they're going to dole some blame out onto Trump, even if they don't know with any real specificity what the allegation is or what actually Trump has purportedly done that makes him some kind of pawn of the Kremlin. So I think there's a political logic there that I think makes sense, but the issue is, if you go full bore with that logic, you're implanting paranoia in the populace. I mean, you're making people believe in the utility of basically what is a conspiracy theory, and I think that has pretty detrimental long-term consequences, because although it might kind of result in short-term political gains, the best way to oppose Trump and to actually rein in his most damaging instincts is to go with a rational opposition, like one that is based on calm, sober analysis, one that is pretty backed up by actual facts rather than wild conjecture and supposition. So the notion that the Democrats' most activated base of people who say are part of this resistance effort, or the indivisible grassroots group, or show up to town hall meetings, the really core segment of the Democratic Party's activist base, the fact that they're so transfixed by Russia, I mean, I think should give everyone pause as to whether this means that they're actually formulating a structural critique of the conditions which led to Trump, or if they're just so hell-bent on damaging Trump at whatever the cost, they're sort of losing sight of the broader forces which led him to gain power. And then so you have that, and in addition to the fact that constantly encouraging this paranoia is creating a domestic political climate where the incentive is on Trump to demonstrate that he is not, in fact, compromised by Russia. And the realm in which he would demonstrate that is in the foreign policy arena. So maybe not cooperating with Russia in Syria, that would be a way for Trump theoretically to prove that he's not compromised by the Kremlin. And he did do something along those lines recently when he launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at a Syrian government base, which is essentially by proxy an attack on Russia, because Assad Assad's government is a client state of Russia. So and you'll notice that Democrats by and large cheered that action. And Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Dick Durbin, almost the entire Democratic leadership structure was in favor of that attack.
Yes.
And even if they voiced reservations like Bernie Sanders,
it was on procedural grounds. Yeah.
Right. Or it wasn't on principle in opposition to the utility of launching an attack, committing an act of war on the Assad government. So the function of the Russia hysteria is to create a climate that is totally warped and is imposing on Trump the worst possible incentives in terms of how he manages his position on the world stage.
Okay. So the second part of that analysis I agree with completely, which is the idea that you have the opposition party so insistent that Trump is Putin's puppet, and they keep saying it, Putin's puppet, Putin's puppet, Putin's puppet. And so what he's going to do is try to prove that wrong. And how do you prove that wrong? Well, like you said, perfect example is wage an attack on, Putin's client state, Syria, and then I mean, it was amazing to see Democrats after the fact then try to act like, no, this doesn't disprove the Russia ideas. It's like, what? Do you not know basic geopolitical facts? They said, oh, well, he called Russia in advance. He called, yeah. Would you rather him not have called him in advance? And that there's no amount, you could call him a year in advance before doing that. Putin would still not be happy with the idea that there are going to be missiles attacking his client state in Syria. So, but there's a part I disagreed with you there. The part I disagreed is the idea that, like, I think this is an issue that is driven completely by corporate Democrats, corporate media, and yes, the establishment, if you will, that's still pretty angry about the fact that Hillary Clinton lost, and they pinned that on Russia because Russia maybe not leaked the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, who then ran with it. So here's the main point. Rachel Maddow, there was an analysis recently in the Intercept. Rachel Maddow covered the Russia issue. It was 53% of her coverage. That means all other issues are getting less coverage than the Russia issue. Now,
and in the month of March, she led every broadcast but one with some kind of rant and raving about Russia.
So here's my contention. This isn't like a genuine grassroots swelling where well-meaning liberals and progressives are like, yeah, treason, Putin's puppet, Trump is a sellout to Russia. It's driven from the top down by corporate media and corporate Democrats. And it's my contention that if they keep pushing this narrative, I don't even think it's a short-term gain, to be honest. I think it will do nothing but lead to the further implosion of the Democratic Party, and they will lose again in the next election when they have such a great opportunity to do what you laid out before, which is just a rational, counter strategy. So there are so many things you could point to. I mean, Trump's first military action as president, killed an 8-year-old American girl. And I've seen like these cute pictures of this poor innocent little girl. If I'm the Democrats, I mean, for principled and moral reasons, but also for political reasons, you should have marches where you all hold up a sign of this poor girl and say, this is who Trump killed, and we need to stop with intervention. And you could talk about the gratuitous drop of the near nuclear weapon on Afghanistan to take out ISIS tunnels that the fucking CIA built. I mean, in his first day as president, he raised taxes on the middle class by rolling back an effective tax break for first-time homebuyers. Like, these are the things that you can build an opposition around because he's doing genuinely unpopular things, like appointing at least 4 different Goldman Sachs people to his administration. So it's my contention that this is like, the establishment doesn't want to talk about the important issues because the important issues would mean an attack on the establishment. So they're finding these side issues that they think they could win elections on, like Russia. But I think it's totally top down, and the grassroots, to the extent any of them have bought into it, they've been duped into it. And I think it's more of a loud fringe that's pushing this issue than a true, like, holding among the progressive and liberal grassroots.
Well, for one thing, a reason why people aren't out in the streets protesting the killing of that American girl in Yemen is because Obama killed the girl's brother a couple of years ago in a drone strike,
sure,
and very few people raised any concerns about it. So there would be kind of a lack of standing there. But anyway, I mean,
it would be hypocrisy, but it's still a smart thing to protest. There would be hypocrisy.
Yeah. So that's just kind of a side point. But I think here's what happened. The furor around Russia originated as a concern among the elite precincts of the Democratic Party and the media. So going back to last summer, people in the Hillary Clinton orbit, people in the DNC orbit, and then their kind of allies in media spheres, they're the ones who originated this line of attack. But after 9 months of this being in the media constantly, and of it being presented as the key to taking down Trump to the people who were most incensed about Trump, eventually that's going to sort of transmute into something resembling a genuine grassroots concern. Now, that concern is sort of contained within a particular segment of the populace. So I don't think it's like something that 51% of Americans necessarily care deeply about. But if you're talking about the liberal activist core of the party, something like, I don't know, 10 to 15% of the population, then yeah, I think at this point it is sort of a grassroots concern. It might have originated as a non-grassroots concern, but eventually when you have Rachel Maddow and when you have other people beating the drum for so long, it's going to be absorbed.
I disagree.
And it's because you have got to go to one of these town hall meetings.
But you're looking at the I'm with her hack loyalist partisan Democrats. That's not the real grassroots. The real grassroots are the people who are out there fighting for Medicare for all. The real grassroots are the people who are saying, yeah, we need to fight on actual issues because we're hurting out here. Real people are hurting because our policies suck. That's the grassroots. But that's like a mucked up corporatist, crowd of the I'm with her people who are still trying to defend the fact that, Hillary lost to Trump and are still trying to say she should have won. I don't consider them the grassroots. I consider them the partisan Democrats, the establishment Democrats.
Well, I mean, we're talking about just ordinary rank and file people. So they're not actually professional operatives. They're just regular people who say joined one of these indivisible groups.
But duped
and then
by
go
those
to
operatives.
Town hall meetings, and then they flood the town hall meeting with posters about Trump and treason and Putin and that kind of thing. And then they make it so that the plurality of the questions asked at one of these meetings relates to Russia. So, I mean, are those people who would just watch Rachel Maddow and sit on Facebook and have all their friends talking about Russia and treason, are they somehow not grassroots simply because their agenda now aligns with the elite segment of the Democratic Party? I don't know. I think that's just like it's overly dismissive of them.
No, they're not grassroots because that's the extent of their activism is to go to a town hall meeting and scream about Russia. The real grassroots are the people who, like we've been working on with Justice Democrats, who flooded the Congress people's offices with calls about how either support H.R. 676, Medicare for All, or you're done for. So that's the grassroots. I mean, you want to talk...
But they're both grassroots. They just have different emphases. So, for example,
but when you're duped by the establishment,
a Democratic House staffer told me a couple of weeks ago now that the number one issue by far for a stretch of weeks that they got phone calls on had to do with Russia. So, I mean, are the people who are just sitting somewhere out in, I don't know, Missouri or someplace who are upset about this issue because of the media diet that they have? Are they not grassroots simply because this is what their focus is?
Yes,
I mean,
they're not. They're not because the grassroots are the people who are focused on the issues and trying to make changes based on the issues. You're describing the problem within the Democratic Party as if that's the grassroots of the Democratic Party. The problem, I mean, you're describing the people who have been duped over by this toxic rhetoric from corporate Democrats and corporate media. So they're suckers. They're chumps. I don't consider them, they're the problem in the party. The solution in the party is the grassroots. And what I mean by that, Michael, is when you look at the polls are clear that the American people, not just the Democratic base, but the American people, they're on board with raising the minimum wage. They're on board with single payer. They're on board with free college. They're on board with ending the wars. I mean, only 17% of the American people in 2013 still wanted to be in Afghanistan. So it's not like what you're describing is you think the grassroots of the Democratic Party are the problem. I think the grassroots of the Democratic Party are the solution, and the problem are the corporatists who have spread this toxic narrative.
Right. And the reason why the narrative is so toxic and insidious is because eventually it was an inevitability that a portion of the actual grassroots would devote their energy to that issue. So when you say something is grassroots, you're not saying that it's good because it's grassroots. Grassroots is just an organic sentiment that is harbored among ordinary people who then coalesce to take action around it. So, for example, in 2009, there was a grassroots dynamic on the right which held that Obama was some kind of Kenyan Islamic agent who had infiltrated the White House, right? And that narrative was in some sense pushed by people within positions of power and influence in the Republican Party. And the people who latched onto it consumed that media, and that's what informed their development of a grassroots frenzy. So it's something being grassroots doesn't necessarily make it good. It just means that it's a real sentiment that is on display within the populace. So that's, I think, how to understand what's going on now.
It's top down versus bottom up. That's the point I'm making. And when you look at the Russia rhetoric, that's top down. That's started by corporate media, started by corporate Democrats, and then it's been, like you said, just dumped on everybody daily for months. And that's what I mean when I say it's not grassroots. Grassroots is a sentiment that originates among regular people, and it's a concern that many people have, and then you push the government to do something about it. Like, for example, ultimate grassroots, the civil rights movement. Okay, there's this problem that the people feel, and we're going to try to fix it. And it's not like that was this. The civil rights movement was started from the top down. It wasn't like you had Martin Luther King Jr. originated and then everybody followed. It's that everybody knew, there's something's really wrong here and we got to fix it. So they all go out there and march in the street, and then you have figureheads that eventually become part of the movement and lead the movement, if you will. But my contention is, if it wasn't for the corporate media and the corporate Democrats driving this train from the beginning, the Russia issue wouldn't have been an issue, because it's made up. It's not. There's no there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, okay. That's why it's sort of like an inversion of how grassroots issues tend to actually come about.
Right.
As I said before, it started as an elite preoccupation. So it started as a political strategy that Democrats in the Hillary Clinton campaign thought would be the most fruitful for them. And then eventually, after it became so ubiquitous in the media, it kind of gets translated into a grassroots concern. But yeah, you're right. It didn't originate as a grassroots concern, which is why this is sort of different.
Right. So, among the smarter people in the crowd that still wants to talk about Russia a lot, I find that the one argument that they make is, or the most prominent argument they'd make is, okay, yeah, sure. Like, sometimes Democrats go too far when they say it's an act of war on Russia's part, or they say they hacked the election, which is a totally misleading thing. But they would usually say, well, this is really about corruption. That's what we're concerned about. We're about corruption here. But my response to that has always been, look, you want to talk about corruption, or you want to talk about having an issue with Trump and foreign governments? He outsources his jobs to literally 15 other countries that we know of. And we even know the extent of which industries are in which countries. And we even know the fact that during the campaign, Trump registered 8 new businesses in Saudi Arabia. So basically, again, in my mind, what happens is it all goes back to, you have butthurt establishment Democrats who are mad because Russia maybe gave the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, and they wish those leaks never came out. So that's why there's this over-focus on Russia. And even when people bring up what could be a legitimate argument of, hey, maybe there's some financial corruption going on between Trump and Russia, my response is, yeah, but why do you only care about that financial corruption? And these same people never say anything about the 8 new businesses in Saudi Arabia or any of the other places Trump has corrupt deals.
Right, and they're making out any potential financial dealings with Russia to be somehow uniquely sinister.
Yeah, right, worse than Saudi Arabia.
Because it bolsters or underscores the overall narrative which they're trying to put forth, which is there is some collusion or Trump is somehow compromised by Russia. So if he has some financial dealing because he held a beauty pageant in Moscow in 2013 or something ridiculous like that, that somehow gives additional credence to the general narrative which they're trying to put forth. So there's a way to be a critic of that kind of deal making without having to, inflect it with this kind of conspiratorial insinuation, and that's the only reason why they're really concerned about it, I think.
Or the hawkish angle. That's what gets me, man. That's the one that scares me the most, is that the worst. I don't know if you saw the segment I did, but there was this article in The Hill where it was like about this committee hearing where the Democrats just went all in on this issue in a way I'd never even seen them do it before, where there was like 4 or 5 different examples in the article of Democratic Congress people flat out saying this is an act of war. This is akin to Pearl Harbor. Like, this is the rhetoric they were using. And then you have Rachel Maddow, who said on her show that if Donald Trump takes NATO troops off of Russia's border, that somehow proves that Vladimir Putin has dirt on him, and what she's referring to, of course, is the infamous so-called pee-pee tape. So look at how this is like the most extreme example of this derangement here, where you have them saying, in order to prove that you're not a puppet, you need to be overtly hawkish and maybe escalate to literally World War III in that instance, which is just crazy, and that proves to me that corporate Democrats have just totally lost their way. They're not connected to the issues by any stretch of the imagination. They're not in principle anti-war, and they don't care enough to talk about single payer or other really important things.
That's one of the most amazing perversions of all this, right? That for a person like Trump, who obviously exhibits belligerent tendencies, the main incentive that has been foisted upon him by the opposition party is that he's insufficiently belligerent.
That's right.
With respect to the country that you would least want belligerence directed at, meaning Russia.
Exactly.
And that the hearing that you mentioned, that was the House Russia. That was the main Russia investigation in the House. That's co-chaired by Adam Schiff and formerly Devin Nunes, and now Mike Conaway, who actually interviewed last week for TYT. And who ran away from me, but when you have people stating in the corridors of power in the American states, so the United States Congress, at a formal hearing, that this supposed breach of the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta constitutes an act of war, I mean, that's creating a climate where that is dangerous for reasons that should be pretty self-evident.
Right.
So the idea that this is the main line of attack coming from Trump's opposition, it's just it really is just incredibly absurd. And it's also ingraining in liberals this idea that it's somehow a liberal value to antagonize Russia.
Yeah.
Or to take actions which are just blatantly aggressive vis-a-vis Russia. Like, for example, you mentioned expanding NATO, or holding kind of military exercises on Russia's border. I mean, think if Russia was holding military exercises in like Tijuana over the border from San Diego, would that be interpreted as threatening by people in the United States? Do I have to really answer that question?
Right.
And of course, the more hawkish elements of the United States would go even more overboard.
Yep. So
like John McCain. Just imagine what his take on that would be.
That's right.
So, I mean, the idea that this is now the climate that's been stoked, I think, is just incredibly damaging. But for what my take is that it's sort of now almost intractable, or there's no going back at this point. The people who are
it's the liberal Benghazi,
of the
man.
party. Yeah.
That's what it is. It's liberal Benghazi, I think.
Well, I mean, but it's different because Benghazi sort of emanated out of the fringes, right? So Fox News pushed Benghazi, right-wing talk radio pushed Benghazi, and it wasn't it didn't come from the center of the political spectrum. It didn't come from the most establishment precincts. Like, it wasn't the Washington Post editorial page and the New York Times and NBC News who were the most vociferous about pushing Benghazi. It was sort of like a right-wing kind of fringe concern that ended up gaining traction because the Republicans happened to control Congress. But what's so, I think, even more disturbing now is that the Russia conspiracy stuff comes from organs which we would see as, in other contexts, the most mainstream organs in American society, like, again, the New York Times, which has been central in propagating this stuff. So it's even more sort of ubiquitous and all-encompassing than Benghazi. And I think Democrats in particular and Democratic kind of influencers are too committed to it at this point to relinquish their fixation. I mean, what would Rachel Maddow's reputational what would happen to her reputation if she just said, you know what, maybe this stuff was overblown, I'm just going to move on now? I mean, after doing a full month's worth of programming about it, where she leads every show but one in the month of March with Russia, I mean, I don't think it's reasonable. I don't think it's within her capacity now to just ditch it.
I don't
So
think...
that's what's dangerous now. It's like it's the hallmark of the classic conspiracy theory, right? You're so committed to the core precept of it that any information, however seemingly contradictory, can be taken as additional proof of the veracity of the theory.
But I don't think it's landing as much as you think it is, though. And my point is, I think if the Democrats, if people in the media and the Democrats were to go to, if they were to wake up tomorrow and just decide, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to not mention Russia at all from now until the 2018 election. And they were forced to go out there and talk about single payer, talk about the minimum wage, talk about unionization, talk about foreign policy, talk about the drug war. If they were forced to do that, I think you would see this resurgence and this grassroots uprising unlike any we've ever seen, because I think people are yearning for a real viable anti-Trump movement, but not as many people will get behind it when the anti-Trump movement is predicated on just such a ridiculous idea like Russia owns him and he's Russia's puppet. And, and by the way, that's the other thing is there's never like a succinct thing that most of the people who push this can give you as to what exactly the issue is here. Like, what do you think? Okay, so what exactly is your concern? Well, he's Putin's puppet, but what exactly does that mean? What is he going to do? What's he going to let Putin invade Kentucky?
The Russia story or the Russia angle, or it never kind of distills down into a central claim,
right,
which is the nub of it, right?
Yeah.
It just kind of like a whole ever-expanding variety of accusations and hunches that seem to like crystallize into this narrative.
And also the hypocrisy on leaks drives me crazy. So if WikiLeaks were to release information, if WikiLeaks had released RNC emails, or if WikiLeaks, or we saw this oftentimes with Snowden or something like that, or Chelsea Manning, like, okay, there were many on the left who were like, oh no, what are you talking about? Of course we need to see this. We learn that the government is spying on all of us and taking our metadata and storing it in some obscure facility in Utah. Or, you learn with the Chelsea Manning leaks that the government, the military is just kind of massacring civilians and being nonchalant about it, and then hitting again when it was media people and the ambulance that's coming to pick them up. And people went, it is ridiculous when the counter argument is, don't talk about this. They're leaks, and the fact that there are leaks is questionable and maybe illegal, so don't talk about the substance of the leaks. There was a time when people on the left thought that was a ridiculous thing to say, but now that's the only thing they say when it comes to the DNC email leaks. We learned a lot of valuable information in those leaks about how there was collusion behind the scenes between the DNC and the media, and they were tipping the scales against Bernie Sanders. And in other leaks, we learned about how Hillary Clinton gave speeches where she said, the rich, there's this new feeling of oppression against the rich in the country, and there's bigotry against the rich, and I want to have totally open trade borders, which is like TPP on steroids. So we learn all of these things that are so important that expose corruption and collusion. And what's the argument from loyalist partisan Democrats? If you even talk about those things, you're like a Russian agent, or, you've been duped.
And that was actually explicitly stated in the Senate hearing 2 weeks or so ago now by this witness, Thomas Rid, who was then, of course, feted on all the talk shows and like heralded as this expert. He actually said that if you do anything which could, even in a very remote tangential sense, advance Russian interests, then you are, in a sense, an unwitting agent. So if you share a WikiLeaks email, you are an unwitting agent of the Russian state. If you, even as a member of the media, report on the contents of the WikiLeaks email, then you are an unwitting agent of the Russian state. So, that is really chilling, especially in Washington, D.C., right, where people are very concerned with their professional prospects. If they can be accused of doing something which makes them an unwitting agent of Russia, that could have real consequences for their career trajectory. So these are people in the in the corridors of power who are have an influence on policymaking. So because you have a guy in the floor of the Senate to, solemn nods of approval by members of both parties, by the way. So this was Republicans and Democratic senators affirming what this guy was saying. Doing anything which can be construed as somehow in service of Russian state goals now makes you complicit with Russia in a direct sense. I mean, unwitting agent, the concept is just so expansive that almost anybody can be charged with it, and it's like pretty much a core tenet of what McCarthyism was.
Yeah.
But of course now it's this neo-McCarthyism, and the ideological kind of contours of it have been totally warped. So it's different. Yeah.
And another thing that really annoys me is that when you look at Obama's rhetoric in 2012, when Mitt Romney said the biggest foreign policy threat is Russia, and Obama said the 1980s called, they want their foreign policy back. We had a situation where virtually the entire Democratic Party was in agreement with what it appears like your position and my position basically is today, which is, hey, it's kind of a preferable thing to not escalate. It's kind of a preferable thing to not. We're not even saying, or certainly I'm not saying, you could tell me what your position is here. I'm not saying we need to be buddy-buddy and great allies with Russia and hold hands and frolic together in the meadow. All I'm saying is don't escalate. Just, have like a neutral relationship is fine with me. And that appeared to be like Obama's position. Like, okay, we're not going to be openly hostile. We're not going to try to escalate. We're not going to be hawkish. We're not going to prod you. But now you're considered to be less liberal if you don't want to prod Russia and escalate with Russia, which is just a perversion of basic, political concepts.
Yeah, one really weird thing is that, the predominant liberal narrative now seems to totally omit what Obama's posture was.
Right.
I mean, Obama forged a military alliance, or attempted to forge one, with Russia in Syria so as to best coordinate strategy with attacking ISIS. Whereas if Trump did that now, he would be immediately accused by Democrats of being compromised by Russia for simply doing basically what Obama had done.
Yep.
And, Obama, very much in opposition to the foreign policy consensus in Washington, resisted arming Ukraine, which would obviously antagonize Russia. So, I mean, a lot of what Obama did, given this current framework, could be interpreted as evidence of his being compromised by Russia, but liberals totally just refuse to grapple with that, it seems. And another point that I wanted to bring up that you mentioned before, when the core charge here is never quite clear. It's always this muddled kind of
amorphous thing, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's down. Look at the terminology that is used, even in the popular media. It's words like interference,
hacked the election,
or hacked, or meddling.
Right.
And those are sort of like hazy terms, and you can sort of it sort of lends itself to open-ended interpretation, right? If Russia interference can mean a whole variety of things,
right?
So even if there are people who think that this should be at the forefront of the agenda, who maybe have a slightly more reasonable take than the more whacked out conspiracy types like Louise Mensch, who is still a prominent voice here.
Yeah.
But both of them can use the word interference to encompass what it is that they're alleging, because it's such an amorphous word. So now even the New York Times is alleging that in the French election that there's Russian interference simply because, and the evidence they have for that allegation of meddling is that RT and Sputnik, these kind of tiny little outlets that the Russian government funds, but which have some degree of editorial freedom, are in operation in France. I mean, that is what the New York Times is declaring constitutes Russian meddling in the French election. And apparently the conspiracies run so deep that 3 of the 4 candidates now in the running are seen as favored by Russia and therefore benefiting from Russian interference. And it's so ironic, and I spoke to somebody, a journalist who's based in Paris and is covering the race yesterday for TYT, and he said, basically domestically within Paris, this notion that Russia is meddling in the election is seen as just a joke.
Yeah.
And it's something that's fixated on mostly by the American media and also the British media. But it's not something that people actually in France view as a living issue.
Well, I was going to say the phrase "hacking the election," that is so immensely misleading that I'm convinced that it was just used on purpose to be misleading. If people come across that, when you read "hack the election," my initial thought when I saw those headlines was, oh, do they now have evidence that Russia literally hacked into voting machines and flipped the votes for Donald Trump? Because that's what it sounds like. So if somebody just reads the headlines, doesn't go into the minutia, doesn't get into the details of it, they could walk away thinking, oh, yeah, what do you mean? Meddling, interference, they hacked the election. And you talk to people today who still have that perception when, again, the strongest charge made against them really is maybe they released the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, who then ran with it. And by the way, I should add here that WikiLeaks to this day swears up and down they did not get it from Russia. And of course, who are the people that are saying they did get it from Russia here in the U.S.? Our intelligence agencies, like the CIA, who are most recently known for doing the torture, doing, mass torture. So who do I believe? I don't know. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks haven't really lied to me yet, and the CIA and intelligence has. So I'm just saying, I don't know. Maybe they were involved, but that's not even conclusive.
Well, on the origins of the DNC email hack, people who actually have looked into this, who were open to the possibility that Russia was responsible back when the hacks actually occurred, so like last summer, now increasingly they are more and more doubtful that the conventional narrative assigning blame to Russia is accurate. Because if it were Russia, you would think that some convincing technical evidence would have been produced by now. But instead, the technical evidence that the entire narrative is contingent on, meaning this assessment by CrowdStrike, a private cyber attribution firm, their analysis seems to have basically fallen apart. And the crux of it, which they relied upon to assign blame to Russia, was that the same malware that had been implanted into this Ukrainian artillery app also had been implanted into the Democratic National Committee and led to the exfiltration of the emails. That has completely fallen apart because the malware is very accessible to non-Russian actors, and it's just very sloppy analysis. Go look at what Jeffrey Carr, who's an expert on this, has said, and even Yasha Levine, who I interviewed on it, has said, and they pretty convincingly say that we should be more skeptical than ever of the veracity of just even that one plank of this wider Russian interference narrative. But in terms of, the phrase hack the election, I think people basically agree now that Russia didn't actually hack any voting machines.
Right. Yeah.
At the same time, when you use that phrase, you have to know it's willful, because
Absolutely.
People who don't follow news obsessively, like say you and I, aren't familiar with the intricacies of what this narrative is supposed to entail, so they can reasonably infer from that phrase that there was some tangible hacking going on. And I think maybe in December or so there was a poll from YouGov. I have to go back and check, but something like a very large amount of Democrats responding to this poll thought that there was actual hacking of the voting machines.
Right.
And even very recently, Adam Schiff, who is the head of this Russian interference investigation in the House, Democrat from Los Angeles, he still uses the phrase hack the election as sort of a shorthand.
Yep.
And he did it in a town hall setting. He did it in a Politico interview. He may even have done it at some point during the House hearing. I'm not 100% sure. I have to go double check. But he frequently uses the phrase. So if he is supposed to be the Democratic Party's authority on the nature of this investigation, and he is giving credence to the veracity of that terminology, then it shouldn't be a surprise at all that rank and file Democrats who are just kind of casual news consumers believe in the more extreme version of the entire hacking narrative.
Right. So now to wrap up real fast, I just want to tell you what would be something that could happen where I would kind of hammer away on an angle of this Russia thing where I think it would be legitimate. So, just to give a similar example here, like, how the Clinton Foundation had taken, what was it, like $1 million or something for Bill Clinton's birthday. They took it from Qatar, and of course,
and that only came out like a couple of weeks before the election. And why? And that came out why? Because of WikiLeaks.
Right. So
that was one of the that was another instance of Russian interference. I mean, the fact that we got more information about how the most powerful people in the country are operating
exactly
and enriching themselves.
So But so we're seeing there is an instance of, a foreign government buying favors, basically. Now, for the Trump thing, my eyebrow would raise if, because he appointed Rex Tillerson for Secretary of State. I'm against that because he's the fucking CEO of ExxonMobil, which is just insane, this marrying of corporation and state here. So he picks Rex Tillerson, and it is true that under Obama, as a result of the Crimea situation, they basically axed that ExxonMobil deal, this multi-billion-dollar deal that ExxonMobil was going to have with Russia. Now, if they were to resurrect that deal, I would say you don't resurrect that. You can't resurrect that deal, because then it looks like, and it probably is the case, that there were conversations where, there was reassurance of, regardless of what Russia does, we're going to go ahead and move forward and financially reward the Russian state, and also most likely reward ExxonMobil, who, of course, Rex Tillerson is still representing, even though he's in government. And that would be just an example of standard corruption to me, where then I would say the Democrats have a point in saying, hey, man, you're being really corrupt here, and that's not cool. But, of course, needless to say, they haven't resurrected that deal yet, and there's no reason to speculate when you already have 8 other examples of him doing more corrupt things involving other nation states, or just the fact that he's $1 billion in personal debt that's mostly held on Wall Street. So there's other things to focus on, but my point is, you would see me get outraged if and when there's the resurrection of that deal, because then I say, well, this was your plan all along. You picked ExxonMobil's CEO for Secretary of State, and you resurrected a deal with a country that, yes, does have human rights violations, and we shouldn't necessarily be in bed with.
Well, I think it's legitimate to examine whether Tillerson in the State Department leads to undue advantages being afforded to ExxonMobil. But at the same time, ExxonMobil is the largest oil company in the world, and the United States is intimately involved in helping to bolster their business interests. And that was the same under the Obama administration, where even after the sanctions were levied, the Obama administration granted ExxonMobil a number of waivers so that they could pursue, narrow aspects of the deal that had been brokered with Rosneft. And that wouldn't be surprising because, it's like and ExxonMobil is associated with American economic prosperity, for better or worse, just like Ford is, which Obama and GM, which Obama helped to bail out, and so on and so forth. So the idea that giving Exxon the ability to pursue the landmark deal that they brokered under Tillerson in Russia is necessarily indicative of some kind of collusion or evidence that Trump is compromised, I think, is a little fanciful. I mean, but again, it does warrant scrutiny just from the standpoint of how are these oligarchs running our government, and is what they're doing corruptive?
That's my main point. That's the point right there, is that it's just like the open corporatocracy that we have, where they're just so brazen in the government not representing the people and representing the moneyed interests, corporations, billionaires, and to the point where you put Exxon CEO as Secretary of State and nobody bats an eyelash. That was another thing where I'm like, the Democrats, I don't know why the Democrats aren't hammering away on that, but the answer is because they, it's not like if Hillary Clinton became president that she wouldn't have had people from Wall Street, for example, as part of her administration. Of course she would have.
Also partially because of the people that Trump was reportedly considering for Secretary of State, Tillerson seemed to be the least bad.
Yeah, John Bolton is obviously worse.
John Bolton, Romney.
I don't know. I'd take Romney over this guy, over Tillerson, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's debatable, but
I'll give you the last word.
And the other thing is
cut out, but go ahead. I'll give you the last word. I sound like O'Reilly. I'll give you the last word. Go ahead.
And the other thing is, there's a legitimate case, with Trump aside, that the sanctions that the United States levied on Russia after the Crimea annexation wasn't necessarily sound policy. So it increased tensions between the two countries. And
I think we have a disagreement on that point, but that's all right.
Well, I mean, I think the point is that it's a legitimate policy debate.
It's certainly a legitimate debate.
Sure, of the sanctions.
Sure. Yeah.
So Trump doing something to ease those sanctions wouldn't necessarily be bad in terms of policy, but of course people would leap to denounce that as evidence of his being compromised. And again, there's no evidence at all yet that he is even going to ease those sanctions, and he never pledged to do so. But the incentive structure now is so warped that if he were to do something that is relatively good, so if you take the interpretation that the sanctions were misguided and Trump lifted them, then you would be in favor of that. But now.
Now it's evidence of him being Putin's puppet. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, which is just bullshit.
It distorts the wider debate, and it makes actually pursuing legitimate policy that much more difficult with respect to Russia.
The best example of that being the troops on NATO's border. If Trump does the right thing, which is takes them off of the border, then that's maligned as weakness and buckling to his overlord Putin, which is exactly what we've been talking about this whole time. So
right.
I said I'd give you the last word, but I lied. I just did the last word. All right, Michael. Thanks so much for joining me, man. Everybody can follow you on Twitter. It's at Michael Tracey, right?
At M Tracey.
At M Tracey. Okay, and Tracey.
Right.
So
that E is very important.
Thanks so much for joining me, man. And I'll see everybody tomorrow. Peace.
All right.